You ever get the feeling your house is haunted, not by ghosts, but by your own water bill? That was me last month, walking through puddles in my backyard, scratching my head, wondering how the ground stayed wetter than a rainforest while my tomato plant died of thirst. It didn't make sense until I checked the footage. See, I'd set up a tiny motion-activated camera mostly out of curiosity, and there she was, the HOA Karen, dragging my hose across the lawn like it came with her property tax. She wasn't even subtle. Floral blouse, massive sunhat, pressure washer in one hand, like she was shooting a commercial for suburban supremacy. She waved at the camera, turned the water on, and soaked her driveway like she was prepping it for baptism. I tried to talk to her, tried to reason. But Karen said the hose was community property, like the HOA bylaws gave her divine rights to everything within sight. And then she smiled, tilted her head, and dared me to do something about it. So I did. I rigged the hose to a nearby sewage tank behind a construction site. No warnings, no more emails. Just silence. And a dirty little surprise waiting for her next rinse and steal session. When Karen moved in, everything changed. Before her, our cul-de-sac was quiet. Maybe a little too quiet, but peaceful. People waved, dogs barked, kids chalked up the sidewalks, and nobody cared if your trash can sat out an extra day. But Karen, she didn't move into the neighborhood. She annexed. It, clipboard in hand, designer sunglasses permanently affixed to her smug little face. She walked the block like she was running for office or hosting a one-woman dictatorship. She wasn't on the HOA board, not officially. But that didn't stop her from acting like she was the entire board. She quoted bylaws like scripture, filed complaints with the speed of a fax machine, and left passive-aggressive notes written in cursive so angry it might as well have been typed in blood. She once knocked on my door because she wasn't sure if my recycling bin had the right kind of blue tint. Who even notices that? Still, I kept my distance. I'm not the neighborhood hero. I mow my lawn, wave politely, and mind my own business. But that didn't stop her from minding mine. She started small, warnings, taped to my mailbox about grass length, mailbox paint, even the color of my porch light. And every time I read one of her notes, I could practically smell the smugness on the paper. Neighbors whispered, sure. Everyone had a Karen story, but no one wanted to confront her, because somehow, she always had just enough technicality on her side to make you second-guess yourself. I tried to ignore her, tried to keep things neighborly, but Karen doesn't do neighborly. She does control, and when her latest obsession became my hose, when she decided she had a right to my water, that's when I realized this wasn't just an annoying neighbor anymore. This was a turf war. And I was done pretending she hadn't crossed the line. It was a Saturday. The kind of Saturday where you wake up late, shuffle into the kitchen half asleep, and try to pretend you're not already thinking about Monday. I had just gotten back from the store, arms full of groceries and thoughts full of nothing, when I saw her, right there, on my lawn, dragging my hose across the grass like she owned the place, like it had her name carved into it with a diamond chisel. She wore this ridiculous wide-brimmed hat that made her look like a gardening influencer from a planet where everyone's made of audacity. The hose was already hooked to some sort of mini pressure washer, and she was spraying her front porch like she was prepping for a royal visit. Not a knock, not a text, just out there in full sunlight, stealing my water in front of God, the birds, and every unlucky soul driving by. I stopped in the driveway, door still open, groceries still in the passenger seat. We made eye contact. She waved. Actually waved at me like we were friends, and this was some charming little community bonding moment. "Hope you don't mind," she shouted over the whir of the sprayer. "Just a quick rinse." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I sat there in the car for a full 30 seconds, jaw clenched, thinking, this cannot be real. I'd never seen someone be that bold, that entitled. She didn't even blink. When I finally stepped out and walked to the door, she gave me the saccharine smile and went right back to scrubbing her porch. Later that afternoon, I knocked on her door, politely. I asked if maybe she had some plumbing issues and needed help, just in case there was some insane, reality-warping reason she thought using my hose was okay. She laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Oh no, I just like your hose better. Water pressure's amazing." Like it was a Yelp review. "We're all neighbors," she added with a shrug. "It's all community property anyway, right?" Community property. I stood there blinking, feeling the words slap me across the face. That's when I knew Karen wasn't confused. She wasn't clueless. She meant it. This was her staking her claim, and it wasn't just about water anymore. It was about control. I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd understand if I spelled it out clearly. I wasn't trying to start a war. I just wanted her to stop siphoning my water like we shared a utility bill. So the next day, I walked over again, calm and composed, hoping we could talk like adults. I told her I wasn't comfortable with her using my hose without asking, that it wasn't community property, that the water was on my bill, coming out of my spigot on my land. She didn't even flinch. She smiled, tilted her head like I was a misbehaving child, and said, "Well, you might want to take it up with the HOA. We're a community, and you're acting very territorial." Then she closed the door in my face, just like that. End of discussion. So I did take it up with the HOA. I emailed them the same day, attached photos of her using the hose, copies of my bloated water bill, and asked politely if there was some policy I'd missed about shared utilities. I explained everything. Figured this was open and shut. But 3 days later, I got a reply. One sentence buried in bureaucratic fluff. "We encourage all neighbors to resolve minor disputes amicably without HOA intervention." Amicably, right. They wanted me to work it out with the same woman who was already claiming my hose as hers. I replied again, more direct. They ghosted me. So I did what any sane person would do. I bought a hose lock. Nothing fancy, just a little metal clasp with a key. Problem solved, right? Karen can't use what she can't access. Wrong? Next morning, I step outside to water my tomato plant, and the lock is gone, not unlocked, gone. Like it had been surgically removed. All that's left is a frayed piece of metal and a sick feeling in my stomach. I look across the street, and there she is, Karen, hose in hand, washing her SUV like she's in a car commercial, suds gliding down the hood, water spraying in all directions like my wallet was footing the bill, because it was. I asked her what happened to the lock. She smiled. "It was a safety hazard," she said. "Someone could have tripped." And then she went back to scrubbing her tires. I stood there in silence, watching the water trail back into the gutter, and I knew I was officially on my own. There's a moment when frustration curdles into something heavier, something sharper. For me, it was that morning, standing over the shredded remains of the hose lock I'd bought less than 48 hours earlier. It had been sliced clean through, like a ribbon at some grand opening ceremony for Karen's new water theft franchise. She hadn't even tried to hide it. No subtlety, no attempt to sneak around. She just cut the lock like it was in her way and went back to treating my hose like a personal extension of her front yard. I took pictures, close-ups of the cut, of the lock fragments, of her once again mid-spray dousing her pavers like they were on fire. I emailed the HOA again, this time with less politeness and more proof. My message was short. She destroyed private property. What are you going to do about it? I got a reply that afternoon. It started with, "Thank you for bringing this to our attention," which already told me everything I needed to know. Halfway through the email, there it was again, that same line, copy-pasted like it was sacred text. "We encourage all neighbors to resolve minor disputes amicably." Amicably. like this was a parking misunderstanding, like I hadn't just found evidence of sabotage in my own yard, like I wasn't being financially drained by someone with the audacity of a cult leader and the charm of an overcooked potato. I paced the kitchen, reread the email twice, then stared at my water bill, still tacked to the fridge. Every drop she sprayed had a $sign attached. Every rinse, every wash, every smug little flick of her wrist cost me. And still, the HOA shrugged. That's when my patience snapped, not with a scream, not with some explosive meltdown, but with a cold, steady silence. I realized the system wasn't broken. It was designed this way, designed to protect people like Karen, people who know how to smile while they steal, who know how to bend rules into shields, and who dare you to stop them because they're betting you won't. But I would. I stopped thinking about rules, about reason, about HOA diplomacy. No more emails, no more polite knocks. Karen wanted to play games? Fine. I was done being the nice guy. It was time to make her regret ever turning that hose. When the people in charge won't listen, you stop talking to them, and you start talking to everyone else. If the HOA wouldn't see Karen's theft for what it was, then I'd give them no choice. I'd make the evidence impossible to ignore. So I ordered a motion-activated security camera. Not the kind with a blinking red light or flashy branding, just a small, discreet lens I could tuck under the eaves, aimed right at the spigot. It arrived in a brown box with no fanfare, but the moment I held it in my hands, I felt something shift. Maybe it was control, maybe it was resolve, maybe it was the caffeine finally kicking in. Whatever it was, I spent that evening wiring it up with quiet, methodical rage. I tested it once, watching the live feed from my phone as I stood in the yard, waving like a lunatic. It worked perfectly. Then I waited. It didn't take long. 2 mornings later, 10:17 a.m. to be exact, the alert buzzed on my phone. I opened the feed, and there she was. Karen, dragging the hose across my lawn with the grace of a sleepwalking pirate. She had a watering can this time, filling it to the brim before strutting back to her flower beds like she was Mother Nature herself. But she wasn't done. She came back, again and again. Hose in hand, watering her front lawn, her driveway, and even a tiny pink flamingo garden ornament like it was a living being. She didn't even glance toward the house. She knew I worked during the day. She thought she was safe. I watched it all, jaw tight, hands shaking. And then, the cherry on top, she bent down to scratch her dog's ear, looked directly into the camera without realizing it, and gave the same smug little smile she always wore, like a crown. It was perfect. I clipped the footage, added a timestamp, circled her face in red. Then I posted it in our neighborhood Facebook group under one simple caption. Neighbor stealing water every morning. Anyone else dealing with this? The responses came in fast. Some laughed, some were furious. Others had their own Karen stories. But my favorite comment of all was from a woman 2 streets over who simply said, "Film her again. Post it all. People like this only stop when you embarrass them." And, embarrassment was just getting started. I thought maybe a few neighbors would see it. Maybe the post would get a couple likes. A few, classic Karen comments. But I didn't expect it to detonate. By noon, the video had 100 reactions. By dinner, over 1,000. Someone shared it on Reddit. Then another person clipped it for TikTok with dramatic music and slow zooms. I watched as the views climbed into the tens of thousands, and then 6 figures. The internet loved it. They dubbed her Hose Karen. Memes popped up overnight. One had her holding the hose like a sword with the caption, "Queen of Entitlement, first of her name, drinker of stolen streams." But it wasn't just the views that mattered. It was the commentary. People were furious on my behalf. They offered legal advice, security hacks, prank suggestions, even a link to a motion-activated sprinkler system that blasts intruders. Strangers from other states chimed in, saying they'd dealt with Karens too. I was suddenly part of a much bigger movement, a neighborhood revolution hosted online. And Karen? Oh, she saw it. I knew the moment she did. The next morning, she didn't steal water. Instead, she knocked on my door. No sunhat, no sunglasses, no fake smile. Just pure, simmering rage, barely tucked behind a pressed blouse and white-knuckled fists. She accused me of harassment, of stalking, of violating her privacy rights. Told me I'd created a hostile digital environment and was spreading misinformation. I told her the video was real. I had every second backed up. She narrowed her eyes, leaned forward, and said 7 words that flipped a switch in me. Do something about it. I dare you. That was it. That was the moment I stopped hoping for justice and decided to deliver it. I watched her stomp back to her porch, fuming, jaw clenched like she'd bitten into a lemon soaked in vinegar and ego. And I smiled, because she had no idea what I had planned next. If she thought going viral was the end, she hadn't considered what happens when the man you're stealing from decides to fight fire with something much, much worse than water. I had a blueprint, I had access, I had a sewage tank. And Karen? She was about to get everything she asked for, and more. Sometimes revenge doesn't knock. It parks itself down the street in the form of a giant humming sewage tank and practically waves at you. It was a Thursday. I'd taken the long way home just to clear my head. Past a construction site on the edge of the neighborhood, guys in hard hats, bulldozers growling, the usual. But then I saw it. Nestled behind a temporary chain-link fence, half hidden by tarps and machinery, sat a massive industrial sewage containment tank. Not a little porta-potty setup either. This thing was the real deal, meant for handling the waste of dozens of workers over several weeks. And just like that, the idea hit me. Terrible, brilliant, poetic. I pulled over and walked up to the fence, pretending to admire the paving work. One of the crew, a guy named Marco, nodded at me from behind a backhoe. I struck up a conversation, said I was dealing with some irrigation issues and was curious about the tank setup. He shrugged, didn't seem to care. I told him I wasn't trying to dump anything, just needed to test a connection for a home project. Slipped him a little cash. He shrugged again and said, "Just don't mess with the pump." Deal. That night, I dug through my shed like a raccoon in a hardware store, pulled out hoses, adapters, PVC couplings, gloves thick enough to survive a biohazard. My hands moved on instinct, part fury, part engineering. I built a splitter that ran a second line, buried just beneath the surface, hidden behind the hedges, leading from my spigot to a new line that looked like my normal garden hose, but secretly fed into the sewage tank. The brilliance was in the disguise. The hose sat there, coiled innocently in the grass, exactly where Karen always grabbed it. To her, it would look the same, feel the same, click into her sprayer the same. But the moment she turned that spigot, oh, she wouldn't be getting water. She'd be baptizing her property in raw, unfiltered karma. I tested the flow once, directing it into a sealed bucket just to be sure. The stench hit like a punch to the soul. Perfect. Now all I needed was patience and timing, and maybe a clothespin for my nose, because revenge was about to get messy. It happened at 10:32 a.m. sharp. I was inside, pretending to read the paper, sipping coffee I didn't even want. But I was watching, had the live camera feed pulled up on my phone, the volume off, the tension coiled in my chest like a spring. There she was, Karen, right on schedule, yoga pants, ponytail, that same smug bounce in her step like she was strutting toward a victory parade. She glanced at my house once, not with fear but with boredom, like she was brushing a fly off her shoulder, and then bent down, grabbed the hose, and dragged it across the lawn like it was a leash, and I was her obedient little water dispenser. She'd even upgraded her setup, a brand new rotating sprinkler, the fancy kind that spins in perfect circles and waters evenly. She hooked it up in the center of her lawn, flipped her hair, and turned the spigot. There was a pause, a gurgle, then boom. A geyser of thick, brown, sludge-like horror exploded from the sprinkler head, spraying in glorious, filthy arcs. It spun once, splattering her lawn, spun again, nailing her front steps, spun a third time, drenching her patio furniture, white wicker now streaked with doom, and then it hit her, mid-step, mid-smirk, right in the shins. She screamed, not a polite yelp, not a surprised gasp, a full-body shriek. Like the gates of hell had opened beneath her welcome mat. She slipped, caught herself, slipped again, and then did a panicked crab walk, back toward the spigot. Neighbors peeked out their windows. Someone gasped. Someone else started filming. I could hear it all, faint through the walls, but crystal clear through the phone. Karen grabbed the hose like she was trying to wrestle a fire-breathing dragon. Sewage sprayed everywhere, across her porch, onto her potted plants, even into a decorative bird bath she once claimed was French imported ceramic. She was soaked, furious, flailing. And the best part? She still didn't know. She thought it was a prank sprinkler or bad plumbing or a cursed garden. She had no idea she just sprayed her kingdom with liquefied karma from a construction site porta-tank. I sat there watching the chaos unfold, and I smiled. Because that wasn't just sewage, that was justice. She stormed across the street hours later, wrapped in a towel that had once been white, now stained the color of regret. Her face was blotchy, hair matted, eyes wild. The scent hit my porch before she did, earthy, sharp, feral. She didn't knock, she banged. I opened the door just enough to see her and felt a breeze of decay roll past me like a warning. "You think this is funny?" she shrieked, waving a clump of something unspeakable that had once lived in her lawn. "You've just committed an act of chemical warfare." I blinked. "You mean the hose?" "You contaminated my property with sewage. That's biohazardous material. My dog was outside. My nephew is visiting next week. Do you know what kind of trauma you've caused?" I didn't flinch. I didn't smile. I didn't say a word. Instead, I calmly pulled out my phone, scrolled to the saved footage, and hit play. Karen, at 10:32 a.m., trespassing onto my lawn, grabbing the hose, dragging it across, hooking it up, turning it on, spinning in glorious slow motion as the first wave of karma soaked her sneakers. She paled. Her mouth opened, then closed. "You recorded me?" I nodded. "On my property, multiple times. Here's Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday, too. Shall I continue?" She went quiet. Not for long. "I'm filing charges," she hissed. "You think the HOA won't believe me?" "They might," I said, "but the internet won't. And neither will the plumbing inspector, the city sanitation department, or the half-dozen neighbors who watched you break the hose lock 2 weeks ago." Her eyes narrowed to slits. "You'll regret this." "Maybe," I said, "but not today." She stomped back to her house, leaking a trail of bitterness and half-dried sewage across my sidewalk like a snail of spite. Later that evening, I got a certified letter on HOA letterhead. Karen had officially filed a complaint, alleging chemical sabotage, emotional distress, and property defilement. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my beer, because I already knew how this would play out. I had timestamps, I had documents, I had receipts, and Karen? Karen had a ruined lawn, a stained patio, and about 30,000 internet strangers who already hated her guts. If Karen thought one sewage storm was the end of it, she didn't understand who she was dealing with. I wasn't some rookie neighbor with a grudge and a grinning lawn. I was done playing defense. This was phase 2. The first thing I did was upgrade the cameras. The little motion sensor tucked under my eaves? That was just the beginning. Now I had a full-circle surveillance grid, 2 cameras mounted in birdhouse decoys, one hidden in a fake rock by the spigot and another tucked into the corner of my garage roof. Infrared, cloud backup, time-stamped recordings. Even if Karen breathed in my direction, I'd have it on video. Then came the hose itself. I built a new rig, cleaner, smoother, seamless. I buried the lines deeper this time, reinforced the valve with a locking case, and added a remote-controlled splitter that could switch between normal water and sewage with a tap from my phone. It was elegant, undetectable, dangerous, and legal. Speaking of which, I made a call to my cousin, real estate attorney by trade, petty by blood. I explained everything, sent him the footage, the HOA letters, even the fine they slapped me with. He laughed for a solid 2 minutes, then said, "If she breathes wrong, we'll bury her in paperwork." I liked that plan. I also started gathering neighbor testimonies, quiet conversations over fences, a few phone calls, even a couple of emailed statements. Turns out, Karen wasn't just my problem. She'd been fining old ladies for wind chimes, telling a nurse her welcome mat was too casual, and once tried to ticket a 12-year-old for sidewalk chalk. By the end of the week, I had a binder, a literal binder labeled Karen Incidents Verified. She thought the HOA was her shield, her fortress. But while she was inside plotting, convinced she still ran the show, I was turning her castle into sand. And she had no idea. Every move she made I recorded, every petty threat I filed. I wasn't just fortifying my home, I was building a case. Because I knew Karen. And I knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was going to come back swinging. And when she did, I wanted the first thing she hit to be concrete. The envelope was thick, HOA seal embossed like it meant something, stuffed with enough paper to look official, enough bold text to feel threatening. Inside was a formal violation notice, citing me for creating a hazardous environment, improper disposal of waste, and, my personal favorite, unauthorized biological retaliation. The fine, $600. I stared at it, jaw tight, the edges of the letter curling in my fingers. Karen had done it. She'd spun her sewage sprinkler meltdown into a martyr's story and somehow convinced the HOA that I was the villain. I called the HOA office, demanded answers. They passed me around, board member to board member, each voice more indifferent than the last, all ending with the same robotic sentence. "We've received a formal complaint and acted accordingly. You may contest the fine at the next scheduled board meeting." The meeting wasn't for another month. They were stalling. And that's when I realized something. Karen wasn't using power. She was using delay, burying me in red tape, hoping I'd pay the fine just to make it stop. So I did what she never expected. I opened the HOA bylaws, all 47 pages, single-spaced, printed on paper so thin it might as well have been spite-soaked tissue. I read every line, twice. And then, somewhere near the end, section 4.2b, I found it. Any homeowner caught trespassing onto another resident's property for the unauthorized use of utilities, e.g. water, electricity, shall be subject to immediate review, disciplinary action, and forfeiture of community privileges. My heart skipped. This wasn't just a line, it was a wrecking ball. I had video timestamps. Karen on my lawn, using my hose, on multiple occasions. I had witnesses, photos, even her on camera, admitting. She used it because we're all neighbors. And now I had the HOA's own rule book, her precious rule book, telling me exactly how to take her down. I didn't yell. I didn't storm into the office. I printed everything, clipped it together in a neat packet, and dropped it off at their office with a smile so polite it could cut glass. They wanted a paper war? Fine. But this time, the rules weren't on Karen's side. They were mine. I walked into the HOA office like I was dropping off cookies, smile on my face, manila envelope in hand, eyes full of fake sunshine. Behind that desk sat Trish, Karen's closest ally on the board, the one who always squinted at me like I'd parked on her soul. "Just dropping off a little paperwork," I said, setting the folder down like it was nothing more than tax returns. "This related to your violation?" she asked, already bored. I nodded. "Thought you might want the full context. Inside that folder, a dossier that would have made a private investigator weep with pride. First, timestamps. 6 different days where Karen had crept onto my lawn, hose in hand, grinning like she was above gravity. Second, screenshots from my security footage, clear, close, crisp. One frame even had her looking directly into the camera with that smug little "what are you gonna do about it" smirk. Third, statements. I'd asked, and the neighborhood answered. Glenn from 2 doors down, Margie from the corner lot. Even old Mr. Hendricks, who hated everyone, chimed in. Each one wrote about Karen's relentless notes, bogus complaints, and obsession with control. And finally, the gem. A printed copy of the HOA bylaws, section 4.2b, highlighted in neon yellow. Trespassing for unauthorized use of utilities is grounds for disciplinary action and forfeiture of HOA privileges. I even included the receipt where I paid $5 for the copy. Just for flair. Trish blinked as she skimmed the top page, her pen frozen mid-air. We'll review this. Take your time, I said. I'll be attending the board meeting. Wouldn't miss it. 2 days later, the street buzzed like a hive. Neighbors whispered in driveways, passed around copies of the footage, and emailed the HOA demanding answers. The tide was turning. Karen had ruled this cul-de-sac like a crownless queen, but now her kingdom was paper thin, and it was tearing. By the end of the week, I got a letter, not from Karen, not from Trish, but from the board itself. A special meeting has been scheduled to address recent policy violations and concerns regarding board impartiality. No fines, no vague threats, just a date, a time, and a quiet admission. They knew. And the rebellion had begun. The meeting room smelled like cheap coffee and desperation. Folding chairs lined the walls, neighbors packed shoulder to shoulder, murmurs low and tense. I stood in the back, arms crossed, dossier in hand, letting the silence of my presence speak louder than any outburst could. Karen was already seated at the front, lipsticked, clipboarded, and clinging to whatever control she thought she still had. She wore this white blouse like it was armor, but her eyes darted like she knew what was coming. The board chair opened the meeting with a dry throat and trembling notes. We've received substantial documentation concerning recent violations, including unauthorized use of utilities and repeated trespassing. Karen shifted in her seat, cleared her throat, tried to cut in. I've been targeted, she snapped, voice sharp, brittle. This is a smear campaign against a woman trying to uphold standards. But the room didn't back her. Neighbors crossed their arms, shook their heads. Even Trish, the ever-loyal Trish, didn't look up from her notepad. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was damning. Then the board chair pulled out the rulebook, read it aloud. Section 4.2b, word for word, then listed the dates. Then showed a still image. Karen, dragging my hose across the lawn, bold as daylight. The motion passed without discussion. The vote wasn't close. Karen was fined $500 for trespassing and utility theft, stripped of all HOA privileges for 12 months, and removed from her advisory position effective immediately. Her mouth hung open like she'd forgotten how to speak. Then, quietly beneath her breath, she called the entire room ungrateful. But no one stood to defend her, not this time, not after the videos, not after the lies, not after the sewage. After the meeting, people lingered. Glenn shook my hand. Mrs. Hendricks, from across the street, actually smiled at me. Someone left a single cupcake on my porch with a note that said, Neighborhood 1, Karen 0. Karen didn't storm off that night. She walked, slow, quiet, clipboard pressed to her chest, like it was all she had left. She didn't look at me. She didn't have to. I'd already won, not just the argument, not just the fine, but the neighborhood. And Karen? She'd finally been dethroned by her own rules. A week later, just when things started to settle, when the air felt lighter, when my hose lay untouched like a retired veteran basking in peace, I got a knock on the door. Not Karen. This time, it was a guy in a reflective vest with a clipboard and a badge clipped to his collar. City Code Enforcement. He looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Got a complaint about a possible illegal sewage connection," he said, glancing down at the form like he couldn't believe he had to read it out loud. I raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess? Came from across the street?" He didn't answer, but the corner of his mouth twitched. I walked him around the side of the house, showed him the hose line, the spigot, the remote-controlled valve, everything. I even handed him the printout showing the temporary access agreement with the construction crew, my one-night cash-under-the-table miracle. He squatted, looked it over, let out a low whistle. "I've seen some petty stuff," he muttered, "but this is next level." I watched him try not to laugh as he took a few photos, purely for the report, then stood up and said, "Off the record, where'd you learn to rig a valve system like that?" I shrugged. "Boredom, revenge, YouTube." He chuckled and shook his head. "Well, no violations here, not even close. Honestly, kind of brilliant. People should pay you a fine for wasting your time." He left with a smirk, but not before saying, "You ought to patent that setup." By the end of the day, word had spread. Karen's final move, her last sad attempt at clawing back control, had fizzled out in the hands of a city employee who found it more entertaining than criminal. She hadn't been outside since the HOA meeting, but I saw the blinds twitch when the inspector's truck pulled away. I didn't wave. I didn't smirk. I just went back to watering my tomato plant like nothing had ever happened, because that's the thing about people like Karen. When the spotlight fades, they can't stand the silence. And this silence, it was earned. One ridiculous hose at a time. It happened quietly, like the final breath of a bad storm. No screaming, no clipboard ultimatums, no final confrontation laced with threats and HOA jargon. Just a moving truck, a couple of tired guys loading boxes onto a ramp, while Karen stood off to the side, arms crossed, lips tight, watching her empire collapse into bubble wrap and cardboard. She didn't say a word to anyone, didn't offer a goodbye or even a final glare. Just climbed into the passenger seat of a silver SUV and drove away, disappearing down the cul-de-sac she once ruled like a plastic-throned monarch. It was peaceful. So peaceful, in fact, that I didn't quite trust it at first. But then, 2 days later, a young couple showed up at her house, bright-eyed, nervous, wearing smiles that hadn't yet been wrung out by HOA politics. They knocked on my door that evening, holding a plate of still warm cookies and 2 mismatched mugs filled with lemonade. "We're the new neighbors," the woman said. "We just wanted to say hi." And then she asked almost shyly, "Do you know where we can hook up our hose? We don't want to overstep." I almost cried. They used their own hose, brought their own welcome, and treated the people around them like neighbors, not subjects. That first night, I sat on my porch and listened to something I hadn't heard in months. Laughter. Real, light, full-bellied laughter from across the street. The new couple was setting up a tiny kiddie pool for their toddler. Spraying water into the air like joy was something you could make with pressure and sunlight. No cameras needed, no retaliation required, just peace. Simple, golden, blessed peace. I leaned back in my chair, looked at my yard, dry, quiet, mine. The hose lay coiled where it belonged, untouched, respectful. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to defend it. Karen was gone, and the neighborhood finally felt like home again. They say the internet never forgets. Turns out, neither do neighborhoods. What started as a quiet act of backyard defiance became a full-blown movement. The video, the spray heard round the world, hit 4 million views before the week was over. Someone added slow-motion edits, dramatic music, and subtitles that read, "When karma flows, it overflows." People reached out from everywhere, other states, other countries, other Karens. They shared their own HOA horror stories. One guy from Arizona emailed me just to say, "Thank you for standing up. I'm building my own valve now." A Facebook group popped up overnight, Hose Warriors United. Someone made T-shirts. Someone else started a subreddit. It was absurd, hilarious, perfect. But my favorite part wasn't the noise, it was the silence. No more notes in my mailbox. No more soggy grass in the morning. No more woman in a sunhat, dragging my hose across the yard like she paid the water bill. I could finally water my tomato plant in peace. Slow, quiet, mine. And every time I turned that spigot and watched the water flow, I smiled. Not out of pettiness, but out of satisfaction. Because this whole mess, as ridiculous and foul and hilarious as it had been, reminded me of something I almost forgot. Justice doesn't always wear a robe. Sometimes it wears gloves and smells awful. And sometimes, when the system fails, you become the system. Not through yelling, not through threats, but through strategy, through patience, through plumbing. Karen thought she could bully her way through a neighborhood. She didn't count on one guy, a camera, and a sewage tank. And now, she was gone. My yard was quiet. The hose rested peacefully. And somewhere out there another HOA Karen was probably loading up a clipboard ready to ruin someone else's Tuesday. But now, people were ready. People had seen what a simple garden hose could do when connected to the right kind of pressure. Because justice, real, poetic, filthy justice, doesn't knock politely. Sometimes it sprays.